Robb Stark stood upon the battlements of Riverrun in the early morning light, alone save for the persistent breeze that tugged at his cloak and ruffled his dark auburn hair. It was a small moment of peace in the midst of war, and he cherished it, breathing in the crisp air, thinking of all that had been lost and all that remained to be saved. Dawn flared pink and gold against the far horizon. Beyond the fortress walls, the quiet fields of the Riverlands stretched out, dotted here and there with the black skeletal remains of farmhouses burned in raids. The common folk had fled by the thousands, crowding the roads and leaving behind their scorched livelihoods. He could almost taste their desperation in the chill air. The wind picked up, and it reminded Robb of winter's approach. The old saying, "Winter is coming," was not just a house motto. It was a truth. And it would come for them all if he did not end this war soon. How many battles had been fought already? How many had died for crowns and vengeance and old grudges? Too many. Far too many. And the toll fell heaviest on the people who owned no banners at all, the small folk who tilled the soil and tended the herds. Their blood had soaked the Riverlands and Westerlands alike. If he continued this war in the same manner, they would pay the price as winter descended. The savage ache in his heart that had once fueled his quest for vengeance had softened, replaced now by guilt. He thought of all those fatherless children, the ravaged farmland, the hungry mouths left behind. It was time for a different path. He turned away from the cold sunrise. Behind him, a soft shuffle announced gray wind. The direwolf rose from his haunches, fur bristling in the breeze. Ever since the day Robb had found him, a pup lost in the snow with his litter, Grey Wind had been his constant companion. The wolf's golden eyes regarded Robb knowingly, as if he felt the change in his master's heart. "Come on," Robb murmured to Grey Wind. "The day waits for no man or wolf." Descending the stone steps from the walls, he passed guards who bowed their heads respectfully. They wore the fierce gray direwolf sigil on their surcoats, but many of those uniforms were muddied or tattered from the endless skirmishes. Riverrun itself had survived many sieges in recent months. Though the Lannisters were currently pulled back, word was that Tywin Lannister was gathering forces somewhere near Harrenhal, and the war had ground on so long that fighting was less a matter of pitched battles and more a matter of savage raids. And so, Robb's sense of urgency grew by the day. He made his way inside the keep to the small solar where his mother, Lady Catelyn, waited. She stood by a narrow window, her face carved with lines of worry and sorrow. Once her expression had been one of gentle grace, a mother's warmth. Now, she had lost so much. Her husband, her 2 youngest sons vanished, her 2 daughters in the wind. But though sorrow weighed on her, it had not yet broken her. She was strong, and he drew from that strength. "My son," she said softly, looking up at his approach. She moved to him and placed her hands on his shoulders. He could see her eyes flick over his face, gauging the mood he carried. "You rise earlier these days. Rest escapes you?" "Nada. Sleep has become an indulgence," Robb replied. "I dream of father, of the snow in Winterfell, sometimes of the crows that circle these fields. I dream of men dying and farmland burning. I can't simply shut it away anymore." She exhaled a gentle sigh. "You bear the weight of a king, and kings seldom sleep well. Is there news?" "Roose Bolton reports that the Lannisters have grown bold in pillaging the countryside around Harrenhal," he said, though he paused to give Grey Wind a comforting pat on the head. "But that's not the reason I'm here. I wanted to speak with you. I've been thinking about the future, about us, about the people." "No." He took a chair near the hearth, one that had served his father many times when they had traveled south. His mother took a seat across from him, her features guarded. She had become used to receiving grim tidings and was bracing for them. He wanted to offer something else. "I have fought for our family's honor," he began. "I have fought for the North's independence from the Iron Throne. I have fought because I wanted justice for father. But the truth is, the bloodshed is endless. The small folk suffer more with each passing day. We ride out to punish Lannister outrages, or the Ironborn slip in behind us to raid the coastline. Even in victory, we fail these lands. I can't bear the thought that the purpose of our battles is lost amid so much suffering." "Mawene." Catelyn regarded him with wary eyes. "You mean to surrender?" "No," he said swiftly. No, not surrender. But I also don't intend to wage the war as we have, ravaging the countryside. There must be another way. The common people, they can't fight, not as we do. They are crushed under the boots of knights and lords on all sides. It's not enough to just bring them some fleeting respite. We must break the cycle that places them beneath a feuding nobility, forever doomed to starve and die for our causes. Nira. I see. She folded her hands in her lap, thinking. Your father believed in justice. He believed in duty. And you are speaking of a kind of duty that goes beyond a single house. Do you think the other lords will follow you if you propose something so radical? They might not, Robb admitted. But they'll have to if we are to win. The people. They are the realm's true strength, not the lords in their castles. If the Smallfolk supported me, truly supported me, I think we could unite them in a cause that might make even Tywin Lannister pause. Nay. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. One of Robb's captains, Edmure Tully's sworn sword, stepped in. My lord, there's a gathering in the courtyard. Men and women from the outlying farms have come seeking help. Robb offered his mother a glance and she nodded. They both rose, and Grey Wind trotted at their heels. The courtyard was alive with murmuring. The throng parted respectfully as Robb made his way through. Lean, weary faces peered at him, a mixture of fear and hope. He saw mothers clinging to children. He saw men with bandaged arms, bearing the battered remains of traveling sacks. He saw old folk stooped with age, glancing about anxiously. One man with tears in his eyes stepped forward, doffing a shapeless hat. His hair was thinning and gray, his clothing ragged, and he trembled as he bowed. My lord, your grace, the old man began, addressing Robb by his title as king in the north. We've come from a village near the river. Lannister men came days ago. They took what little was left of our harvest. Took my grandson too. He was 16. At that, a pained murmur rippled through the crowd. They'll bleed him for Tywin Lannister's war? Someone muttered. Robb's jaw clenched. The anger was still there, but tempered now by determination. He placed a hand gently on the old man's shoulder. I swear to you, we will do all we can to recover your grandson. We will ensure you have food and shelter within these walls. No more of our people should face such outrages. The time has come for a different way. No. The old man's voice quavered. Thank you, your grace. We are at your service. We'll tend fields or mend your walls, though we have precious little to offer. But we will do as you command if you promise to help us. Robb realized this was the crux of it. The man's offer of service came from desperation, not real choice. So had it always been. The Smallfolk flocked to whichever lord might protect them in that moment. They were mere resources to the great houses. He looked about at the gathered crowd, at the children who clung to their mothers, at the gaunt men who had lost limbs or loved ones, at the wounded who gazed upon him with what little hope remained. I will protect you, Robb said. And more than that, I want to free you. A stunned hush fell over them. Lady Catelyn's eyes flickered with apprehension, as if fearful of how the crowd might interpret such words. But Robb continued, for his heart commanded he speak plainly. We will not ask more blood from you. Too many of you have already shed it. From this day forth, the Smallfolk who follow me are no mere subjects. You are free men and free women. I want you to have a say in what becomes of these lands. With your help, we can build a realm where lords no longer torment you for a whim, and where foreign soldiers cannot trample your homes without retribution. I will ask for your strength in forging this new peace. I will ask for your hearts, to believe in a better future. But I will never demand that you kill for me, if you do not wish it. I vow to you by the gods old and new, we will end this cycle of bloodshed. No. He did not speak as loudly as some might expect a war king to speak, but his voice carried. The onlookers glanced among themselves with cautious, flickering hope. Such grand promises did not come from the highborn as a rule. With their uncertain eyes upon him, Robb lifted his chin. In return, I swear the North will stand as your shield. If we must fight, it will be with the cause of your freedom at the fore. If any lord would oppress you, he shall face the combined strength of the North. No man in these lands is property, be he a blacksmith or a farmer or a shepherd. Anyone who stands with me stands as a free person, no matter their birth, no matter what banner once flew over them. Ah. A stirring passed through the courtyard. Whispers. Disbelief. Then a few voices cheered, timidly at first, until the sound grew into a trembling chorus that reached the high walls of River Run. The old man who'd spoken first bowed again, tears shining in his eyes. A mother with her child pressed a hand to her heart, trembling with relief she could not yet name. Amidst them all, Lady Catelyn studied her son, clearly both proud and uncertain, for his vow was an earthquake in a land defined by unyielding feudal custom. If Robb meant this truly, he was sowing the seeds of a new order as radical as a northern winter sweeping the south. That night, Robb did not sleep. Word of his declaration was carried beyond River Run, swirling through the taverns and over campfires. Men passing on the road shared stories of the king in the north who promised freedom. Some were surely dismissed as mere rumor, but others, especially those who saw the sacked villages, began to wonder. Whispers of a different future teased at the hearts of the downtrodden. Perhaps, they thought, we need not always suffer. So it was that by the time a fortnight passed, Robb began to see men and women gathering with fresh purpose. Not kneeling out of fear, but approaching the gates of River Run with open hands, asking how they could help reclaim a stolen farmland, how they could guard the roads from bandits, how they might stand against the Lannisters not simply as forced conscripts but as free folk. It happened slowly at first, a trickle of brave souls. But as the rumor traveled, every passing day brought more, small folk from hamlets in the Westerlands, from the scorched farmland along the Trident, even from the battered edges of the Vale. Some had lost everything and were willing to gamble their lives for a dream. Others came from remote corners, eager to see if Robb's word might be truth. They came, they saw, and they began to believe. Edmure Tully, who had resumed control of River Run after the passing of his father Lord Hoster, regarded these developments with open skepticism at first. "Nephew," he said one evening in the Great Hall, "you know I respect your father's memory and your convictions. But to promise the small folk they are all free, as if they were lords themselves, have you considered how the other great houses will respond? We are at war with the Lannisters. Should House Tyrell or House Greyjoy catch wind that we seek to upend the entire feudal order?" "Let them catch wind," Robb said firmly. "Their system has already fractured. The Iron Islands claim the north as spoils. The Tyrells bicker with the Lannisters over dominion in King's Landing. The realm is splintered. Someone has to provide a vision of unity. My father always said the smallest man can cast a large shadow if he stands in the right light. The small folk are many, and if their hearts are one, no house in Westeros can stand against them." Edmure studied him a moment, then sighed, recalling perhaps the legacy of Ned Stark. The Tully words are family, duty, honor. These past years, we have seen how easily duty can lead to ruin and how honor can vanish when swords are drawn. If you believe this is the right course, we Tullys will stand with you. But I warn you there will be consequences. Catelyn, who stood beside Robb, placed a hand on her brother's arm. "Thank you, Edmure. Your loyalty means more than you know. And I agree with Robb. This war has gone on too long, soaked the Riverlands with blood. If there is a way to end it for good, let us try." Nangere. Messengers began to ride out under Robb's orders, escorted by small companies of Stark men. They carried messages to every corner of the Northern Army, to every castle that had declared for Robb Stark, instructing them to treat the small folk who approached in peace not as peasants, but as potential allies. They carried new orders for the Outriders to protect any small folk caravan seeking sanctuary, and to refrain from raiding farmland. In short, the Northmen were to show mercy wherever possible. Some lords balked. Others, especially those who had grown weary of burning towns, embraced it. Slowly, the shape of the conflict began to shift. It did not happen without bloodshed. In the field, some Northerners found themselves ambushed by Lannister outriders who took advantage of their newly merciful stance. But the small folk, no longer cowering in fear, began to guide the Northern soldiers, alerting them to where Lannister men were camped, offering intelligence and safer routes. This synergy saved many lives. The small folk even began coordinating at the local level, passing hidden messages, establishing vantage points. All at once, Tywin Lannister found that the Riverlands had become a web of watchers, not of lords but of common men and women. His foraging parties were attacked in the night by ragtag bands brandishing spears and pitchforks. Farmsteads that once gave up their grain without a fight started offering organized resistance, for they believed in the king and the North's promise. This was more than peasant revolts that lords crushed. This was a popular resistance that was being fed and armed quietly through the ravaged countryside. Tywin's outriders could burn a hamlet to the ground, but more would rise up beyond the next hill. Soon word reached Robb that the Lannisters had begun to pull back their forces in some regions of the Riverlands, uncertain which villages might rise in open rebellion. Robb's own armies advanced carefully, forging alliances not only with the Smallfolk but also with hedge knights, mercenaries, and any lordling who saw an opportunity for a freer realm. Some lesser lords joined him when they discovered that Robb was not trying to seize their lands, but rather to eliminate the cause of strife altogether. Others remained loyal to Tywin out of fear or tradition. In the midst of this shifting political landscape, an emissary arrived from the Vale, Lady Brienne of Tarth, sworn to accompany Sansa Stark. News of her approach spread quickly, and Robb greeted her with open arms within the walls of River Run. By her side was Sansa, who had changed much since they last parted. She was still gracious in her manner, but there was a hardness about her eyes that spoke of all she had endured in King's Landing. She curtsied to Robb, though he hurried forward and embraced her, trying not to crush her slender frame with the force of his relief. "My sister," he murmured, stepping back to look upon her. "Gods be good, I'm so glad to see you alive and well." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "So much has happened, Robb. I've dreamed of being home again." He guided her to a private chamber where they could speak quietly, Lady Catelyn and Brienne joining them. Once inside, he listened intently as Sansa shared her journey, her forced marriage to Tyrion Lannister, her flight from King's Landing with the help of an unlikely ally, and her eventual refuge in the Vale under her aunt Lysa Arryn. But Lysa's instability forced Sansa to seek safety with Brienne's protection. They had narrowly avoided being captured by the Knights of the Vale, who were also fractious amid the chaos of the war. When Sansa paused, Robb spoke gently. "Sister, I know you have suffered greatly in those halls. The Lannisters have shown you cruelty. But there's something you should know. Our fight is no longer about revenge alone. We have bigger aims now." "Wine." He explained what he had set in motion, how the North was forging alliances with the Smallfolk, how the cause of freedom might be the best way to end the war and protect the realm from further chaos. Sansa listened with parted lips, as though hardly believing. When he finished, she let out a trembling breath. "When I was in King's Landing, I prayed every night for someone to save us. The cruelty of Joffrey, the manipulations of Cersei. I saw so many good innocent people crushed underfoot. If you can end this war and do it in a way that spares others from that torment, I will stand with you in whatever way I can." Now, one. Brienne, standing protectively at Sansa's flank, offered a small nod of agreement. The tall warrior had seen firsthand the results of Lord's games upon the innocent. "I will fight for you, your grace," Brienne said. "With all my strength. I have seen enough sorrow in these lands. A realm built on the common good is an ideal worth bleeding for." Their support buoyed Robb's heart. For so long he had fought with a righteous anger that felt lonely. Now, he felt camaraderie, not only with his lord's bannermen but with everyone who hoped for a kinder future. If that was not the truest path, nothing could be. In the days that followed, more ravaged farmhands poured into River Run. Some families left behind only the older and firm, but they came anyway, willing to accept the king in the North's outstretched hand. The fortress that once housed the few Tully retainers and a garrison of Stark soldiers soon became a bustling hub of tents and makeshift dwellings within its walls. The novices among them helped care for the wounded. Anyone with skill in forging or crafting was put to work repairing tools, building better shelters, or forging crude weapons that might arm the next wave of volunteers. A true community emerged, Northerners teaching a craftsman's trade to a boy from the Westerlands, Riverlanders sharing fish with Iron Islanders who had forsaken the ways of pillage. It was messy, chaotic, but there was a warmth to it unlike any camp Robb had known. Amidst this vibrant upheaval came a raven from the west. One of Lord Tywin's heralds had stated a demand, that Robb Stark lay down his arms, that the families of the Riverlands submit once more to the Iron Throne and pay restitution for the war. Otherwise, Tywin threatened to flatten River Run and subject every rebel to execution. Robb convened a small council in the Great Hall. Lady Catelyn, Edmure Tully, the Great John, Roose Bolton, who had been chafing at this new approach, and a few other key advisors. Sansa attended at Robb's side, while Brienne kept guard near the door. The letter was read aloud. As soon as it was done, the Great John let out a bellowing laugh. That old lion is getting desperate if he thinks we'll lay down our swords now. Roose Bolton's pale eyes glinted in the candlelight. I wonder. Tywin Lannister is a cunning foe. If we ignore his demand, he will march. We have the Smallfolk's support, but they are hardly a disciplined fighting force. Winter creeps closer. Robb folded the parchment, setting it aside. It's time to confront him directly. We'll not cower behind these walls as he threatens us. Tywin Lannister's hold on the throne is tenuous. He's lost support from the Tyrells, who are furious that the crown coffers run dry. If the small folk of the Reach come to our side, the Lannisters may be left with little but empty boasts. Now, Catelyn frowned. We don't have the forces to face him in a pitched battle, especially if he's reinforced by the remnants of Joffrey's king's men. We need a different sort of engagement, one that capitalizes on the small folk's active involvement. Robb nodded slowly. We can't defeat Tywin by sheer might, but we don't need to. He's lost the hearts of the people. We have it. We can lay a trap of sorts, but it must be built on the people's collaboration. If Tywin marches on River Run, the roads he takes and the towns he passes through will all be united in their resistance. He will be cut off from supplies, from intelligence, from local support. We can harry his column with small, precise strikes. Our outriders will lead him into a labyrinth of sabotage. By the time he tries to lay siege to River Run, he'll be too weak to sustain it. Nee. Bolton's lips twitched at the corners. It's risky. War always is, Robb said. But we have something more powerful than cunning alone. A cause that men and women are willing to fight for of their own free will. And so, they began to plan. Scouts reported that Tywin's armies were massing at Harrenhal, a once great fortress now half ruined, towering black against the sky. It had perhaps 20,000 men, fewer than before but still formidable. Forces loyal to the king in the north, including the River Lords, numbered around 15,000, plus a swelling militia of small folk that could swell their ranks or hamper the Lannisters' march. Yet, it was not about raw numbers anymore. It was about will. Messengers galloped out again, coordinating the final pieces of a grand strategy. Every hamlet, mill, or fishing village in the path of the Lannister approach was quietly prepared. They hid their harvests away, salted their fish in secret storehouses, dismantled or poisoned wells that the Lannisters might use. They rigged hidden snares along forest trails. They faked compliance, offering illusions of easy plunder or lodging, hoping to lure the Lannisters in. Meanwhile, Robb's outriders, in small swift cavalry units, prepared to strike isolated groups. Some knights scoffed at these tactics, calling them cowardly. But Robb insisted that the conventional rules of warfare had only preserved the oppression of the powerless. This war was about something else. When at last word reached River Run that Tywin Lannister and his host had begun their march, Robb gathered his forces. They left River Run in the capable hands of Edmure Tully and a contingent of watchers, and they took the field. Accompanying Robb was Grey Wind, never far from his side. The direwolf sensed the tension of the coming confrontation, every hair on his thick coat bristling when horns sounded along the camp. Alongside Robb rode the Grey John with a savage grin, Roose Bolton with calculating eyes, and a dozen of Robb's key bannermen. At the rear were supply wagons, guarded not merely by soldiers but by smallfolk volunteers, many of them determined to see an end to the Lannisters' tyranny. Their pace was steady, watchful, the entire host mindful of traps and ambushes. As the days passed, they moved north and east, trying to draw Tywin into a region thick with farmland and hidden gullies, where the small folk had set their snares. Early skirmishes went well for Robb's side. Scouts reported Lannister outriders stumbling into villages that seemed deserted, only to be surrounded by pitchfork-wielding peasants in the night. The outriders fled, leaving their dead behind. Each success gave the people more confidence. More joined the militia, swelling their ranks. Then came the day of the first major confrontation. Near a crossroads by the ruins of a burned sept, Lannister forces clashed with an advance company of Northmen. Heavy cavalry wearing the lion's sigil crashed into Robb's outriders. It was a bloody engagement, but the Outriders managed to hold them in place just long enough for hidden archers, small folk and northerners alike, to rain arrows on the Lannister flank. Chaos ensued. When Tywin's men tried to retreat, they found peasants had felled trees across the road. By the time they cleared the logs, more arrows flew, and the Lannister cavalry broke and scattered. Robb lost good men, but inflicted far more losses on Tywin's. That night, the king in the north and his men lit small fires across the hills, leaving the Lannisters to cower under the open sky, far from any friendly hearth. From that moment on, Tywin marched in fury. Step by step, his army limped deeper into the labyrinth of sabotage. Wells were foul or dry, so thirst plagued his columns. Villages that looked ripe for pillage turned out to be booby-trapped. Barns exploded in flames the moment men tried to claim them for shelter. And all the while, Robb's forces circled the edges like a stalking wolf pack, striking the rearguard, then melting away. The small folk had become eyes and ears, and more. They blocked roads, burned bridges behind Tywin's army, corralled them inexorably into a region dotted with swamps and streams that were difficult for heavy wagons to navigate. Tywin could have turned back, but pride refused him. He had boasted he would flatten River Run, so forward he went, pressing on in desperation. Yet the further he advanced, the more tenuous his supply lines became. Men began to desert. Horses died of thirst or lameness on broken roads. A sense of doom seeped through the Lannister ranks, and they grew vicious, lashing out at any sign of resistance. The small folk paid in blood, as did the Northmen caught unaware. War was never clean. But for every atrocity Tywin's host committed, the people rose in greater defiance, galvanizing their hatred into cunning, united action. Robb's mind whirled with conflicting emotions as daily reports arrived. He celebrated the small victories, mourned the innocent still slaughtered by rampaging knights, and consoled himself with the knowledge that these horrors might be the last throes of a war that had bled Westeros white. Each night when he closed his eyes, he prayed for peace and the wisdom to steer them all to a better day. Finally, as the harvest moon hung low and orange in the night sky, Tywin's battered remnants made camp in a broad plain less than a day's ride from River Run. It was a strategic position, or as strategic as was left to him, with a creek to one side and a small ridge on the other. Now for the first time Robb prepared for open battle. His own host had nearly 20,000 counting the Smallfolk militia. Not all were well armed or well trained, but their morale soared. In the darkness, campfires dotted the landscape like stars. Soft singing spread among the tents, a sign of unity and hope. On the eve of battle, Robb stood at the edge of the camp, gazing across at the distant Lannister torches. They seemed fewer now, flickering like a last breath. Beside him, Lady Catelyn approached, cloak wrapped tight about her shoulders. She came to stand in silence for a time before speaking. "So much loss," she said finally, her voice subdued. "So many families shattered. I still can't believe we stand on the brink of what may be the final fight." Robb's eyes flicked over to her. "Mother, do you believe Father would approve of what I've done, gathering the small folk as allies?" She placed a hand gently on his arm. "You have honored him, Robb. Your father believed in protecting the weak, upholding justice. This war might have broken that, but you've managed to salvage something pure. I see the gratitude in the faces of the people who follow you, not because they must, but because they want to. That's something no lord in Westeros has truly had." "Well, nine." He nodded quietly. She offered him a warm if trembling smile, then left him to his thoughts. Robb soon felt another presence approach. Grey Wind came first, sniffing the air. Then Sansa appeared, her expression set in determination. "Robb," she said softly, "I want to help in the battle tomorrow." He glanced at her in surprise. "You're not a warrior, Sansa, and I'd not have you risk yourself." "I know," she said, clasping her hands together. "But I can still help coordinate the small folk. They trust me, they see us Stark, and they remember your promise. Brienne and I have spoken to some of the women who came from the Westerlands. They have friends among Tywin's ranks, forced conscripts, men who might defect if given a chance. Let us try to encourage them to lay down their arms tomorrow, spare themselves and us more bloodshed." He closed his eyes, feeling relief wash over him. "Yes. If there's a chance to end it without more killing, do it. By all the gods, do it." "Nor." She smiled sadly and touched his hand. I'll do what I can. The next morning dawned in a swirl of pale gold. Heavy fog clung to the ground. Robb rode out with his bannermen at his sides, gray wind loping ahead, the great wolf's breath steaming in the chill. The lines were drawn, Tywin's army ragged and diminished, but still sporting brilliant red and gold banners, faced Robb's forces with direwolf and trout standards fluttering. Behind Robb, rows of militiamen and women stood in varying armaments. Some had spears or bows, others had axes, a few only clubs. Mixed among them were the veterans of the northern host, steel-clad and resolute. A hush fell as both sides awaited the first horn. Robb guided his horse forward. Across the field he saw Tywin Lannister riding at the head of his lines. Even from here, he could see the grim set of the old lion's jaw, the hatred that burned in his pale green eyes. Robb raised a gauntleted hand. From behind him, Sansa's banner-bearers stepped forward. One of them held a white flag with a direwolf sigil, signifying a parley attempt. He saw the confusion ripple through the Lannister lines. The banners parted, and Tywin himself spurred his horse forward with a small entourage. Robb did likewise, accompanied by his mother, the Greatjon, Roose Bolton, and Sansa Dottai. They met in the center of the field, tension crackling in the cold morning air. Grey Wind trotted beside Robb, teeth bared at Tywin's horse, causing it to dance nervously. Tywin narrowed his eyes at the dire wolf, then looked at Robb. His voice was ice. You wish to parley? After you've starved and hounded my men with your peasant brigands. Naratain. I wish to end this war, Robb replied. Too many have died on both sides. If you lay down your banners, if you release your claims to the riverlands in the north, we can negotiate a lasting peace. No more coin demanded from the Smallfolk. No more ravaging these lands. Tywin's lip curled. You speak of negotiation, boy, as if you're already my equal. You're a traitor. A wolf who forgot his place. My men will fight to the last man if necessary. The Lannisters do not yield to peasants. No. A murmur of anger went through Robb's group, but he silenced them with a glance. Then, you mean to destroy us all, yourself included, Robb said calmly. Look behind me, Lord Tywin. Do you see these ranks? They are not just Northmen. They are farmers, fishermen, crofters from across the realm, men and women who stand here willingly. If your men do not lay down their arms, this field will run red. And for what? A throne no one truly wants to serve under you? Tywin's face hardened. I had hoped you would see reason. To spare your mother's life if not your own. So be it. He turned his horse abruptly, cloak flaring, and rode back to his lines without another word. Robb sighed. He looked at Sansa, who swallowed hard, her face pale in the morning light. Do what you can, Robb told her. She spurred her horse to a vantage near the center of the lines, where a small standard-bearer hoisted a banner that read, Lay down your arms, you are free. The letters were large enough to be read from afar, and a second identical banner was placed at the flank. A few voices from the Lannister side carried across the field, shouts of confusion, mocking, disbelief. Still, Sansa's volunteers called out to them, appealing to any forced conscripts or men of low birth. There is a better way, join us and live. Then the horns blew. For a moment a stillness deeper than any hush enveloped the battlefield. An entire war hung on the edge of that sound. From Tywin's line came the first surge of cavalry. Shouts rose, and the thunder of hooves tore across the grass. Robb gave the signal. Archers loosed arrows in a great volley, and some of the cavalry fell, horses screaming. Others pressed on. The day exploded into chaos. But chaos with a purpose. Robb's lines did not break formation. The first rank braced spears. The second rank knocked arrows. The cavalry on the flanks waited for the signal to charge. Robb rode among them, forging quick commands. When the Lannister knights hit, they collided with a wall of steel. Men cried out, steel clashed, the reek of blood filled the air. The wave faltered. And behind that first wave Lannister infantry advanced. Roose Bolton's men pushed forward in cold, methodical RCS, slicing through the disorganized pockets of Lannister foot soldiers. On the other side, the Greatjon led a thunderous cavalry flank charge that enveloped the Lannister right. Meanwhile, Sansa's militia lines held carefully in the center, raining arrows on the enemy from behind the shield wall. Now and then, a Lannister conscript would drop his sword and flee, some even stumbling across the battlefield to the northern side. Smoke curled in the air as pockets of the plain were set aflame with pitch. Robb saw a group of Smallfolk archers cheering as 4 Lannister men surrendered, dropping to their knees. The archers waved them behind the lines. Tywin's center was weakening. Grey wind dashed between the chaos, savaging one foe after another with terrifying speed, driving panic through the Lannister ranks. But still, Tywin's personal guard kept the old lions safe. Robb glimpsed Tywin in the distance, holding fast with a swirl of red cloak, orchestrating a desperate stand. The day stretched on, exhaustion pressing on every side. Finally, the northern flank swept around, closing off the Lannister retreat. Tywin's men began to fold inward, many throwing down their arms in fear or despair. A ragged cheer broke from the Smallfolk lines as they realized they were winning. They pressed in, capturing more and more foes who no longer saw hope in Tywin's cause. When at last the Lannister horns sounded the retreat, it was too late. The field belonged to the king in the north. Tywin found himself surrounded, half his guard dead or wounded around him. Robb rode forward, breath fogging in the evening chill, his sword dripping red. The clangor of steel on steel faded into scattered pockets of skirmishing behind them. Grey wind bared his fangs, but stood poised at Robb's side awaiting a command. Tywin gazed up at him from his horse, face drawn with exhaustion, yet fiercely defiant. Blood trickled down his temple. The old lion seemed to sense the inevitability of it. The Great John and Bolton flanked Robb, tense. The Smallfolk drew near too, forming a ring. This moment was not just about capturing a lord. It was about seeing justice done. "You have lost," Robb said quietly. "Call off your remaining men." Tywin's voice trembled with fury. "You are a fool if you think you've ended this war. My son Jaime still commands the King's Guard in King's Landing. The Tyrells could yet." "The Tyrells are fracturing," Robb cut in. "They have no gold left to buy armies, not with the crown's debt so great and the Iron Bank refusing more loans. You stand alone, Tywin. And the Smallfolk all across Westeros have awakened. They will no longer bend quietly to your demands, or mine, or anyone's. The old ways have died on this field." "Nay." Tywin closed his eyes, as though in resignation. Then he began to dismount, moving stiffly. When he stood, he let his sword drop to the ground with a clang. It was a gesture that signaled surrender. Robb turned to the Watchers, men and women who had fought for their homes, lost family to Lannister swords, or lived in fear. Their eyes were upon him, waiting to see if he would let vengeance rule. He stooped, picking up Tywin's sword. For a moment, he stared at the polished steel, and his reflection wavered along its blade. Then he slid it into the scabbard at his hip, the clink echoing in the hush. "Lord Tywin Lannister," Robb said, voice carrying across the field, "you are my prisoner. You will answer for your crimes against the North and the Riverlands. And if the people of the realm wish to judge you, then that is what shall happen. No more lords passing private sentences behind castle walls. The Smallfolk who have suffered will have a voice in your fate." The Great John let out a cheer at that, echoed by the throaty roar of dozens of peasants. Catelyn exhaled in relief. Sansa, tears streaking her cheeks, watched in quiet awe. Roose Bolton's face remained unreadable, but he bowed his head. Around them, the captured Lannister soldiers dropped their arms en masse, some in defeat, some in relief. The day was done. The war, in many ways, was done as well. In the days that followed, the news of Tywin's defeat spread like wildfire. The king in the north had broken the lion's spine on a field of freedom-seeking Smallfolk. King's Landing shook with uncertainty. Cersei Lannister, left with few resources and fewer allies, found the capital in turmoil. The people there too rose in protest against their corrupt officials, emboldened by the stories from the Riverlands. Jaime Lannister tried to maintain order but found more and more of his men refusing to suppress crowds. A city that had once cowered under the might of the throne now roiled with demands, and the seeds of a freer realm sprouted even in the shadow of the Iron Throne. Robb led his hosts south to the outskirts of King's Landing, not as a conquering hero but as a guardian. Along the way, he worked to restore order to the towns ravaged by war. Food stores were distributed fairly. The once feuding houses of the Riverlands were compelled to come to a council that included the Smallfolk's representatives. A new way of governance began to take shape, a council formed by representatives, rather than a single king's decree. Robb, though recognized as king in the north by his own people, served as a guiding voice, a shield, not an unchallenged ruler. Everywhere he went, people cheered for him, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in what he had done. When he finally arrived before the gates of King's Landing, the city guard opened them without a fight. They had no reason to oppose him. The city was in uproar, but it was not chaos alone. It was an awakening. Robb did not ride straight to the Red Keep to claim the throne. Instead, he dismounted at the city's edge and walked among the cramped streets, Sansa by his side, Grey Wind pacing at his heels. The smell of refuse and unwashed bodies assaulted him, but he saw also the fiery spirit in the eyes of the city's inhabitants. A throng pressed in around him, chanting blessings or calling out to the Wolf King. He raised a hand for silence. Soldiers formed a ring to keep him safe, but he signaled for them to stand aside. With a calm, strong voice, he addressed the crowd. "I have come not to be your king but to free you. Too long have you suffered the whims of a throne that took more than it gave. I am here to tell you that it does not have to be so. You are free folk, all of you. You may remain loyal to the old ways if you wish, but know that if you desire a voice in what becomes of King's Landing, if you desire to share in shaping these lands, you need only stand with me." A roar went up, a cry of relief, joy, disbelief. Many pressed forward, tears in their eyes, laying hands upon Robb's cloak or Sansa's skirts, some kissing Grey Wind's massive head in trembling adoration. That was the day King's Landing discovered it could unshackle itself from the fear of lords and rulers who only valued their own power. Word of this spread far beyond the Crownlands. The Vale, the Reach, even the Stormlands, battered by war and strife, saw the tide shifting. One by one they opened their gates or welcomed envoys to talk about the new order. Lords who clung to the old ways found themselves isolated, as their small folk rose up in defiance, refusing to supply them with food or arms. The Iron Islands were trickier, for their raiding tradition ran deep, but with no ally left in the Lannisters, and with the North and the Riverlands united in vigilance, the Ironborn gradually lost their taste for endless struggle. Their own small folk, thralls and fisherfolk, were inspired by Robb's example and demanded an end to the reaving economy. Even some Ironborn captains found themselves forced to concede. In time, a great council was called in King's Landing. Representatives from every region of Westeros journeyed there, including the Smallfolk, chosen by their own communities. This was unprecedented in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Sansa played a key role in organizing it, her innate sense of courtesy and negotiation bridging divides. Lady Catelyn advised from experience, making sure older feuds did not sabotage the new peace. Robb presided without sitting on the Iron Throne. Instead, they gathered in the throne room, the monstrous seat of swords behind them, symbolic of the old, oppressive order. Robb stood on the floor, face to face with the council. Tywin Lannister, under guard, was brought before them to answer for his crimes. He stood there, silent and sullen. The small folk had their say. War orphans from the Reach testified how Lannister foragers burned their farms. Mourners from the Riverlands described unspeakable atrocities. The council was not kind. Tywin Lannister answered curtly, refusing to show remorse. Some demanded his head. Others argued that the cycle of revenge must end, that mercy would define the new order. Ultimately, Tywin was stripped of lands and titles, and he was sentenced to spend his remaining days laboring alongside the poorest of the realm in a place where his golden name had no meaning. The Lannister seat in the Westerlands passed to whomever the new local councils would choose, a step that indicated how far Westeros had come from the old feudal lines. As for the Iron Throne itself, the new council debated. Some wanted Robb crowned king of Westeros entire, while others clamored for a council-based government where each region would hold a voice. Robb listened more than he spoke. In the end, the council agreed upon a system that blended both. Each region could choose its own leadership, and all would gather regularly to address matters of realm-wide concern. No single king would hold absolute power. The North would remain under House Stark's guidance if they so wished, but as equals to the other domains. It was not a perfect system. No new system ever is. But it was a beginning. And it was theirs, forged by the will of the people, not decreed by bloodlines alone. When the final agreements were signed and sealed, a hush filled the throne room. Robb looked around at the assembled crowd. There were knights and fishermen, ladies and seamstresses, blacksmiths and scribes, lords who had survived the war. All shared the same determined expression, for they had tasted the possibility of unity. He heard the distant call of gulls from the Blackwater Bay, carried on the wind through the broken windows of the Red Keep. The city still bore the scars of cruelty, but it also pulsed with the energy of rebirth. Grey Wind rested at Robb's side, massive head on his paws, glowing eyes watchful. Sansa stood near, her hands folded at her waist, a gentle smile gracing her lips. Lady Catelyn was at Robb's other side, tears gleaming with pride and sadness. Her husband Ned had not lived to see this day, but his spirit hovered there in the hearts of his loved ones. They stepped outside into the courtyard. The sun shone bright. All at once, a great roar went up from the people gathered, an exultant cry that echoed through the city streets. Robb blinked against tears, lifting a hand to greet them. Then he saw a sight that made his breath catch. Among the crowd, a scruffy boy in rags, perhaps 15, stood with a wooden crutch. He waved it high in the air, joy shining on his dirty face. He cheered for Robb, for the Starks, for the new realm where a boy like him might not starve or be whipped for the amusement of some knight. That was the face of the future, and it was worth every ounce of sacrifice. Over the weeks that followed, as the council's new laws began to filter through the realm, Robb made sure that local assemblies, composed of both lords and small folk, were established to settle disputes fairly. Castles opened their gates to peasants seeking refuge, not as servants but as neighbors. Knights found themselves needing to earn trust from the people they once lorded over. In some places, old resentments flared. Not every lord relinquished power easily, and not every farmer found generosity in his heart for those who once oppressed him. It was in many ways the hardest challenge of all, building a lasting peace among men and women who had only known war and subjugation. But the momentum of the people would not be denied. They had discovered that together they could topple even the mightiest lord. They had discovered that in their unity was power stronger than steel. Robb Stark became more symbol than monarch, a living pledge that no man's birth determined his future. In King's Landing, they took down the Lannister banners and replaced them with the flags of the new realm, 7 sigils woven into one, a testament to a unity never before seen. In the north, Winterfell began reconstruction at the hands of a free workforce who knew they were building their own future, not just a fortress for a distant king. The riverlands, long ravaged, slowly healed. Broken mills were rebuilt, farmland was planted with seeds provided by a new communal store, and the Trident's banks buzzed with life. Even the Westerlands, once Tywin's seat of power, found itself forging a path forward with a freshly appointed leadership council, financed by the region's gold mines but directed, for the first time, toward the good of the realm instead of Lannister glory. Some changes were small but potent. Harvest festivals flourished, no longer subject to oppressive levies. Smiths discovered they could innovate without fear of being undercut by a greedy lord. Women who had lost husbands to war found roles in the new councils, forging local laws. The faith of the 7, the old gods, and even the Red God, each had adherents who learned to coexist under a policy that guaranteed freedom of belief so long as none persecuted others. The realm's tapestry grew richer, shaped by the hopes of every class, every walk of life. Sansa thrived in this new environment. She found a calling in mediating disputes and hosting gatherings that bridged social divides. Through her gentle manner, she soothed old enmities, forging friendships across lines once thought unbreakable. Lady Catelyn devoted herself to charitable works, building a network of help for war widows and orphans, ensuring they received land or resources to rebuild their lives. It was a final tribute to Ned Stark's memory that no child should suffer as her own children had. Brienne of Tarth, sworn once to protect Lady Catelyn's daughters, now dedicated herself to upholding the new laws on the roads and highways, ensuring that travelers of all classes were safe. Many a brigand discovered that the tall maiden's sword was no less sharp in peacetime than it was in war. As for Robb, some wondered if he would marry again to secure alliances, or if he would remain unattached, focusing on the cause that defined him. He took no bride in haste. Instead, he worked tirelessly to nurture the alliances he had forged with common folk and lords alike, traveling from region to region, ensuring the new system of local governance took root. In the twilight hours, he found moments of reflection. Sometimes he walked the battlements of whichever castle gave him lodging, gray wind at his side, the wind tugging at his cloak. He would look out over the quiet farmland beyond, remembering the day he had stood on Riverrun's walls at dawn, gazing at blackened fields and hearing the silent cries of the people. Now many of those fields were green again, dotted with new thatched roofs. People tilled them not in fear but with hope. In his heart, he held a memory of his father's unwavering sense of honor, of how Ned Stark had gone south to protect Robert Baratheon's children and ended up losing his life in the pursuit of justice. Robb had felt rage then, and the thirst for vengeance. But if his journey had taught him anything, it was that vengeance alone could not heal a realm. Only compassion and unity could. To free the Smallfolk was not an act of sentiment alone. It was the forging of a realm where the lines between highborn and lowborn blurred, where justice did not bow to gold or crowns. Thus did Westeros enter a new chapter. The War of the Five Kings ended not with one king triumphant but with a people awakened. Edicts spread swiftly, carried by ravens that soared over roads once choked with refugees. Lords who embraced the changes were welcomed. Those who resisted lost their power to the will of their own Smallfolk, who now knew they could claim their rightful place in guiding their land's future. Across the sea in Essos, merchants marveled at stories of a realm forging new governance on the ashes of a gruesome civil war. Some believed it a fool's dream that would collapse into fresh feuds. Others saw it as a sign of unstoppable progress. For Robb Stark, each day was both burden and joy. He had forged a bond with the realm's people that transcended old loyalties, and with that bond came the promise that he must always serve them faithfully. Not as a tyrant, but as a shepherd of unity. This was, in many respects, more difficult than waging war. Yet he faced it with the same steadfast resolve that had carried him to countless victories, guided by the memory of all the innocents lost along the way. On a calm morning in Winterfell, some months after the last battles, Robb rose before dawn and walked the castle grounds. Rebuilding efforts had returned the stout walls and towers to a semblance of their former glory. The new keep was partly staffed by volunteers from various parts of the north who saw this place as a shared inheritance. A warm breeze drifted across the courtyard, stirring the scents of pine and freshly turned earth. Gray wind padded at his side, ears pricked forward. He approached the godswood, its ancient weirwood standing silent watch, red leaves rustling softly. The face carved into the trunk seemed to weep red sap, a 1,000-year-old sentinel to the faith of the old gods. Robb knelt before it, pressing his hand to the rough bark. He closed his eyes. "Father," he whispered to the hush of the forest, "I have done what I believe is right. If I have erred, guide me. If I have strayed from your path, forgive me. I only wish to spare our people the torments we have known." He felt no words in reply, only the stir of the wind through the leaves. But a sense of peace came over him as though the old gods watched with gentleness. Gray wind nudged him, a soft huff of air as if in comfort. Robb rose, pressing a hand to the direwolf's thick fur. They left the godswood and ascended the walls, from which the view stretched across the wolf's wood. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in pastels of orange and pink. The old ramparts creaked beneath their feet, but the stone was strong again, a testament to the communal effort that had rebuilt Winterfell. Snow still lingered in shaded corners, a reminder that winter was not so far away. Yet there was time enough to store grain, to support each other through the cold. The realm was learning how to endure together. Below, the courtyard stirred with life. Workers mending a stable roof, children chasing each other around a well, an old woman tending herbs in a modest garden plot. This was not the forced labor of serfs, but the self-directed work of free folk who took pride in a place they could call their own. Robb felt a swell of quiet satisfaction. The effort continued every day to maintain this new order, and it was far from perfect. But it was worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, for the sake of this living vision of peace and independence. At that moment, Lady Catelyn emerged from the keep with a handful of letters, presumably messages from lords or councils in other regions. She spotted Robb atop the walls and offered a small wave, an unspoken invitation to join her. He waved back, then paused, lingering for one more breath of the crisp northern air. Gray wind panted softly at his side. A swirl of memory rose, battles fought, The heartbreak of losing father, the fear for his sisters, the bitterness that once gnawed at him. And then the turning point, the day he stood among the burned farms of the Riverlands and realized that a new path was needed, not just for House Stark but for all the people of Westeros. Now that path stretched out before him like an open road, uncertain but full of promise. Robb Stark smiled and gazed over the land he loved, a land no longer moored in feudal shackles. The Smallfolk were free, and in their freedom was the bright hope of tomorrow. Then he turned away from the sunrise and made his way down to the courtyard, ready to face the day's challenges with a heart tempered by justice and guided by compassion. For winter would come again and storms with it, but now, the realm would stand as one family against the cold. Robb Stark leaned on the stone balustrade of Winterfell's restored ramparts, gazing down at the courtyard as men and women bustled about in the early morning light. The castle had become a living testament to the new unity blossoming across the realm. Though banners still flew, House Stark's direwolf high on the repaired towers, and smaller flags for various northern clans, free folk enclaves, and even Riverlanders, they were joined now by plain white cloths symbolizing the common cause. No longer were these walls meant to keep the powerless out or locked in. They were fortifications for all, a shelter under which everyone might contribute to the well-being of the land. He caught sight of a young woman, a farmer's daughter from the Barrowlands, instructing several older men in the best ways to arrange the gardens. They listened, heads bowed respectfully, a reversal of the once unyielding hierarchy in which young Smallfolk deferred to older lords. Now, expertise, not birth, mattered most. Grey Wind padded at Robb's side. The direwolf had grown calm of late, more watchful than fierce, as if sensing that Robb's battles were no longer about swords in the field, but about hammering out laws and forging alliances. Yet each morning, Grey Wind snuffled at the wind with a faint restlessness, reminding Robb that dangers still lurked beyond these walls. The realm's transformation was an ongoing experiment, and experiments rarely proceeded without challenge. From below, the clang of hammers rang out in a cheerful rhythm. A group of workers, Smallfolk, but also a few younger sons of northern lords, were repairing a portion of the outer curtain wall that had been demolished during the Greyjoy occupation. Their pace was steady, dedicated. Winterfell might never look exactly as it once did, but it would stand for centuries more, shaped by many hands. Any who passed by offered a nod or a greeting to Robb, some calling out, "Good day, your grace," or "Morning, King Robb." He smiled and waved in return. He had never grown used to being called "Your Grace," but as the face of this new realm, he accepted it with humility. He was not a king in the old sense, and he would never again want to be. He served the people. He thought that might be the truer definition of a king anyway. He heard footsteps on the stairs behind him and turned. Lady Catelyn approached with a handful of letters clutched in her hand, her auburn hair pinned back, faint lines of age and sorrow etched into her face. She still wore those lines proudly, a survivor of countless trials. Her expression was mild, as if bracing for a conversation she'd had many times before. "Good morning, Mother," Robb said. "Word from the councils." She nodded, offering him 2 parchments. One from the Westerlands, the other from the Vale. "You know how precarious things have been in the Westerlands since the Lannister seat was stripped from Tywin. Their local councils are fractious. Some families remain loyal to the Lion Sigil, though they say they support the New Order. Infighting and sabotage are rumored. The Vale is more peaceful, but your Aunt Lysis, well, her grip on certain parts of the territory complicates matters. Even though she no longer sits as the unquestioned Lady Paramount, she still tries to influence her regent's council in ways that serve her own resentments." "Nay, do I?" Robb sighed. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. In the Westerlands, they've had generations of rule by the Lannisters, tearing out a root that deep leaves the soil disturbed. And the Vale, Aunt Lysa has never been one to set aside personal vendettas. We'll have to be careful." "Aye," Catelyn nodded. "Care and patience. The same approach we've taken in the Riverlands and the North. It's worked well here, but the changes require time for trust to grow." She squeezed his arm gently. "I know it's taxing for you, my son, but you're doing well." Robb offered a small smile. "Thank you, Mother. If Father were here, he'd probably have an easier time with all of this." His mother's gaze softened. "Your father would be proud to see the realm healing, You have his sense of honor, and perhaps a more flexible grasp of strategy. It's what the times need. Robb turned back to the parapet, scanning the horizon as if to glimpse the challenges that might loom. He looked for any sign of a raven, a dust cloud of traveling caravans, anything. Across the courtyard, Sansa emerged from the keep, conferring with Brienne of Tarth. The tall warrior nodded as Sansa pointed to a ledger. No doubt they were coordinating supply routes or a new plan for the Smallfolk who had recently migrated from the Vale. Sansa herself had grown adept at both negotiation and oversight, her courtesy a balm on local disputes that might otherwise flare into violence. Each time Robb saw his sister stepping confidently across the yard, he marveled at her transformation from the frightened girl they'd once known in King's Landing. The war had tempered her spirit, forging steel under her gentleness. Another day's work, Robb said quietly, turning to descend the steps with his mother. Grey wind padded after them. They made their way down to greet Sansa and Brienne. As they traversed the yard, Smallfolk parted respectfully but did not kneel. Bowing and scraping had largely fallen out of favor. A respectful nod was often enough. Robb returned those gestures in kind, stopping here or there to exchange a few words or jokes. Sansa turned with a bright smile as they approached. Robb. Good morning. I've just received a note from the southern roads. More freedmen are traveling north, some from the Crownlands, others from the Stormlands. They hear tales of Winterfell's new opportunities, farmland to rebuild, communities that welcome them. We'll need to ensure enough lodging and resources. Brienne inclined her head. We can arrange more tents in the outer bailey for temporary housing, but we'll need to transport lumber from the Wolf's Wood for permanent dwellings. Also, a few returning families have discovered partially collapsed farmsteads in need of thorough repair. Caitlin pressed her lips together in concentration. We'll need to coordinate with the local weavers and carpenters. Some of those families lost everything. We can't let them freeze once winter sets in. Robb nodded. Agreed. We'll draw up an allocation of resources. Perhaps send a request to Torrhen Square for extra timber. The Manderleys in White Harbor might also help with shipping in any additional supplies. We'll ask them politely. They've been quite eager to support the new order. Yes, Sansa said, marking a note in her ledger. So far, the Manderleys have proven generous in distributing fish and grain, particularly to families along the King's Road. They might be willing to send carpenters as well. She smiled at Robb, her eyes reflecting a sense of purpose that had been missing in her King's Landing days. She was no longer the frightened girl who hoped for a prince's rescue. She was a Stark of the North, standing on her own. Brienne gave a short bow, then headed off to see to the tents. Caitlin followed, speaking quietly with Sansa about the resources in the storehouses. Robb stood a moment, taking in the swirl of purpose around him. A stable hand led a pair of newly arrived horses into the yard. Two men in battered cloaks hopped down from the saddle, scanning the courtyard in open awe. Robb recognized them as traveling blacksmiths from the Riverlands, who had once served House Frey. Their eyes lit up when they spotted him, and one doffed his hood respectfully. These were the folk who had once had no voice, no seat at the table. Now they had come here willingly, part of the realm's new fabric. It was heartening. Still, he couldn't forget that such a radical transformation would inevitably draw more formidable opposition from those who clung to the old ways. A flicker of memory tugged at him, recalling the cynicism in Roose Bolton's eyes after the war's final pitched battle. Bolton had knelt in grudging respect when Tywin Lannister was captured, yet his acceptance of the new order never seemed wholehearted. That was something to keep in mind. Already, rumors had reached Robb that some of Bolton's men terrorized smaller hamlets, flexing the old style of brutal discipline. Robb meant to address that soon, but each day brought new fires to quench. He inhaled deeply, pushing aside the weight of troubles for now. There was much to do, but at least no armies were massing on Winterfell's borders. The realm breathed a cautious peace. Perhaps given enough time, the fractures would fuse into a lasting unity. With that hope in mind, Robb turned and headed toward the Great Keep, where the business of governance awaited. In the Great Hall, still modestly restored with fresh timbers supporting the vaulted roof, Robb took his seat at the large wooden table that had replaced the dais. He refused to sit on a raised platform anymore. He took his place at eye level with other council members, albeit with Grey Wind lying at his feet. Slowly, representatives of different factions in the north and beyond trickled in to discuss the day's matters. Some were old friends. Wyman Manderley's cousin, Sir Herrick, a jovial man with a belly that strained his belt, who had arrived to broker trade agreements. Others were Smallfolk delegates from across the region, including a stern-faced woman named Ida, who oversaw resource distribution to newly freed thralls from the Iron Islands. A pair of traveling septons joined them as well, ensuring the faith's perspective was heard, though they'd long since accepted that their voice was one among many, not the only moral authority. Robb gestured for the group to seat themselves. "Let's hear from you all," he said. "We have many pressing concerns. Sir Herrick, how fares White Harbor?" The stout man rubbed his chin. "We're faring well, Your Grace, though our stocks of certain cereals run low. The new Freedmen's Council from the Crownland sends more and more hungry travelers our way. We do our best, but I'd ask for a joint effort to bring more grain from the Riverlands or the Vale. We can provide fish in exchange." "Nay." Robb nodded. "A fair arrangement. I'll speak with the Riverlands delegates. They've had good harvests along the Red Fork now that the war's ended. We might arrange a stable trade route, distributing surpluses across the north for fish and other goods. Ida, you mentioned something about more thralls arriving from the Iron Islands?" The stern-faced woman folded her arms. Your Grace. They call themselves free now, but we all know the Ironborn tradition is hard to break. These thralls come with scars. Some Ironborn captains tried to maintain small strongholds in the northwestern coasts, refusing to acknowledge your new laws. We've managed to chase them away with help from the local militia, but the thralls wander, uncertain of their place. We could settle some here in the north. Others might prefer to return to their families if they can find them. Wow. Robb considered, exchanging a quick glance with Lady Catelyn, who had settled to his left. "We'll set aside farmland near the stony shore for any thralls who wish to remain. If they want to go south, we can arrange that too. No one will be forced anywhere. But we must ensure enough provisions. I'll request additional flour from the Manderless, so these folk have bread. We can build them homes or let them build their own. We'll ask for volunteers from the local villages to help. It'll take time, but it's the only path forward." Ida nodded, her weathered face relaxing slightly. "Thank you, Your Grace. They'll be grateful." And let us see. One of the septons, a younger man named Septon Hamar, ventured a question. "Your Grace, some of the more traditional members of the faith are concerned about what they call moral decay. Lack of deference to the gods, or the erosion of the old institutions that once governed marriages, property, even trials. They worry that with too many changes, chaos will reign. Will the new councils still respect the seven, or we'll see?" A hush fell around the table. This sort of question was inevitable. Robb answered carefully. "Everyone in this realm has the right to worship as they will, whether they follow the seven, the old gods, or the red god. That won't change. The new councils are not meant to undermine the faith. They're meant to ensure that no single creed or institution has absolute power over others. If the faith is strong in people's hearts, it has nothing to fear from broader freedoms. My mother and I were both raised in the faith of the seven. Whatever ever domain that our daughters abandon?" Septon Hamar dipped his head. "I see. I thank you for clarifying, Your Grace." The meeting continued for another hour, with discussions of road repairs, distribution of livestock, forming a new northern militia to help secure remote villages, and so on. By the time they concluded, the day's brightness had shifted with the sun's climb, sending long shafts of light through the hall's windows. Robb rose with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. The real labor, he thought, was no longer brandishing a sword. It was forging agreements, bridging differences, and keeping thousands of new earnest participants in governance from tearing each other apart. He dismissed the gathering and stepped outside for a breath of air. The courtyard greeted him with a swirl of activity. Children chased each other around a well while Bard played a merry tune on a lute near the steps of the great keep. Some older folk lingered to listen, a rare moment of respite from labor. A pair of blacksmiths hammered new horseshoes near the forge. Grey Wind followed Robb, occasionally pausing to sniff at people passing by. The dire wolf was so familiar to them that they greeted him with as much warmth as they did Robb himself. Sansa stood near the stables reviewing a parchment with Brienne. When she saw Robb, she smiled and waved him over. "We've heard from the Vale," she said as he approached. Lady Lysa? Well, Aunt Lysa has made a show of support for our new councils, but privately we're told she's not letting go of old grudges. There's a rumor she might invite certain lords who disliked father to gain influence in her region's council. The voices are concerned. Robb frowned. We can't allow personal vendettas to sabotage the people's progress. But we also can't force her hand. If we appear too controlling, we'll look like hypocrites. The area might remain somewhat isolated until Aunt Lysa sees the benefits of cooperation. Let's maintain open communication with the Vale's Smallfolk delegates. If they want to push for new leadership, we'll support them. But we'll respect the process. Brienne nodded. Wise. Many of the Vale's knights respect you, and that respect may sway them more than Lysa's grudges. I can ride out to the Bloody Gate if you wish. Speak to some of the knights loyal to House Arryn. Remind them of their duty to the people. No. That might help, Robb agreed. Coordinate with Sansa. If you see trouble brewing, return quickly and let us know. Brienne bowed, then turned to speak further with Sansa Paul. Robb watched his sister, once again marveling at how naturally she managed all these details. She had an instinct for courtesy and empathy that smoothed tensions, and her time among the schemers in King's Landing had sharpened her wits. Robb left them to their task and crossed the yard to the small Godswood Gate. He felt drawn to the serenity there. Pulling the hood of his cloak over his hair, he ducked inside. The gloom of the ancient trees was calming, their leaves whispering overhead. The heart tree, an old weirwood with a solemn face carved in its pale bark, stood sentinel in the center. Robb approached it softly, gray wind trailing behind. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the mossy ground. He knelt at the base of the tree and placed a hand on its trunk, letting out a slow breath. Sometimes he spoke quietly, though whether he was praying or merely confiding in his father's memory was uncertain. Father, if you're listening, know that we're doing our best. We've ended one war, but the real battle is preserving a realm that no longer thrives on bloodshed or oppression. I pray you guide us. I'd sooner have your counsel in the flesh, but I'll settle for the quiet echoes of your honor. He closed his eyes, feeling gray wind settle on his haunches beside him. Wind rustled the leaves. For a moment, Robb could almost believe he felt his father's presence, calm and steady. Ned Stark would have appreciated this quiet revolution, or so Robb told himself. In the hush of the Godswood, all the burdens weighed less heavily. He allowed himself several heartbeats of peace before drawing in a resolute breath and rising once more. The next weeks passed in a steady rhythm of building, trading, and forging new agreements. Ravaged farmland was replanted, old enemies discovered shared hopes, and the North became something more than a mere feudal domain. From all corners of the realm came scattered reports of similar changes. Some places embraced them wholeheartedly, while others resisted. Robb's presence, and the living memory of the people's triumph, often paved the way for acceptance. He traveled often, to White Harbor, to the Last Hearth, even as far as Moat Cailin to oversee how the Freedmen's Council integrated with older local houses. The roads were safer than they'd been in years, patrolled by volunteer militias who saw it as their own interest to keep the peace. But the realm was not yet wholly at peace, for storms gathered in subtle ways. In the burnt remains of old villages, discontent festered among certain outcasts. Some had once been loyal knights or petty lords who hated the new order that stripped them of their privileges. Others were common brigands who saw no difference between the old laws and the new, content only to profit by theft. They raided unsuspecting travelers or smaller villages, sowing fear in pockets far from Robb's immediate influence. Messages about these bandit attacks reached Winterfell all too frequently. Each time, local militias struggled to chase them off, but the bandits melted into the forests and hills, re-emerging elsewhere. It was an insidious threat that sapped the people's morale. Another simmering source of unease came from beyond Westeros. Word traveled slowly from across the narrow sea, but rumors persisted that Daenerys Targaryen was growing in power. She had 3 dragons, and she had freed the slaves of several great cities in Essos if the reports were true. Freed slaves in Essos. The parallel was obvious. Whispered tales claimed that Daenerys might someday sail west, hoping to reclaim the Iron Throne. Yet, under this new order, there was no real Iron Throne to claim, not in the old sense. If she did come, would she fight Robb, or would she see in him a kindred spirit? Would she even care that Westeros had changed so drastically? No one knew. But across the sea soared dragons, and dragons rarely left the world undisturbed. Late one autumn afternoon, as Robb was in the midst of reviewing supply ledgers, a horn sounded from Winterfell's walls. He lifted his head, exchanging a wary glance with Sansa, who sat at a small desk across from him. The horn echoed a second time, a note that signaled the arrival of important guests. Sansa stood, smoothing her skirts. "Shall we see who it is?" "Let's," Robb said, setting aside the parchment and leaving the study with her. Grey wind followed, tails swishing. They emerged into the courtyard as the massive gate swung open, revealing a small party on horseback. At the front rode a knight in battered silver armor, wearing a tabard that displayed House Royce's sigil, albeit faded. Beside him was a young woman in a plain cloak, her hair braided with a single silver ring. Robb recognized her from earlier Vale gatherings, Anya Stone, a bastard cousin of the Arryn line, who had become a prominent voice for Smallfolk rights in the Vale. They dismounted carefully. The knight removed his helm, revealing a lined face and graying hair. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing low. "I am Sir Theomund Royce, come as an envoy from Lady Lysa Arryn and the Vale's council. We bring tidings of both trouble and possibility." Robb stepped forward. "You're welcome here, Sir Theomund. And you as well, Lady Anya." He nodded at the young woman, who returned a polite curtsy. "Come inside where it's warmer. We can speak in the great hall." Moments later, they were all seated at the long table with steaming cups of mulled wine. The travelers' cloaks hung by the fire to dry. Sansa took a seat near Robb while Catelyn soon joined them, greeting the newcomers with a calm but guarded expression. Grey wind lounged at Robb's feet, occasionally sniffing the air. Sir Theomund cleared his throat. "Your Grace, Lady Lysa sends her regards. She remains Lady of the Eyrie, but as you know, the Vale's council wields growing authority in the region. Tensions rise between some of the older lords, like Lord Nestor Royce and the Belmores, and certain Smallfolk leaders who want to follow your example more fully. They see how you've ended the old feudal tyranny in the north and yearn for the same. Lady Lysa tries to play both sides, but we fear open conflict could erupt." Anya Stone nodded. "There have already been violent incidents on smaller scales. A few bailiffs loyal to the older lords demanded tribute from certain hillside villages. The villages refused, stating they now recognized only the council's new laws. A scuffle broke out, leaving 3 dead. Word spread quickly, and tempers run hot. Some call Lady Lysa the rightful ruler. Others insist that any single ruler is tyranny by another name." "No." Robb listened intently. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to bloodshed. Did the council not reach an agreement on taxes and tribute last season?" "They did," Anya said, "but Lady Lysa refused to sign it. She claims the Eyries overhead, maintenance, security, requires the old system of tribute. And that's torn the Vale in two. We've come to ask for your help, Your Grace. Mediation, perhaps. Or an assurance that if the Vale's Smallfolk are attacked by these lords, they can rely on your protection." "No." Sansa exchanged a look with Robb. Catelyn's gaze tightened. This was her sister they spoke of, complicating matters with personal ties. Robb pressed his lips together. "I want to avoid a second war. If we sweep in and forcibly change the Vale's leadership, we become tyrants ourselves. But if we allow Lady Lysa to cling to old ways at the cost of her people's welfare, we betray our new realm's ideals. We need a balanced approach. Perhaps a formal delegation from the north could mediate. We can gather the Vale's key players, lords, Smallfolk representatives, and see if we can draft a compromise that fosters true autonomy. I'll come in person if necessary." "Was?" Sir Theomund let out a breath of relief. "That is precisely what many in the Vale hoped for, Your Grace." Lady Catelyn spoke gently. "My sister may be stubborn, but she's not immune to reason. Her biggest fear is losing everything. Her son, the Eyrie, her sense of security. If we show her a path that protects her and the Vale's traditions while embracing new freedoms for the people, perhaps she'll yield." "Nay." Anya Stone's eyes flickered with hope. "We can try. The lords might resist. But if you're present, they'll remember the fate of Lord Tywin. They'll know that the realm has changed." At the very least, it should keep them from open violence while we talk. Robb glanced at Sansa, who nodded. Then let's prepare for a journey to the Vale. Before the snows get too deep, we can cross the Bloody Gate. We'll bring only a small escort so as not to appear threatening, but enough to ensure our safety. We'll call a grand meeting of their council. If we fail, well, let's hope we don't. Nidinjar. Sir Theomund and Anya both sighed in relief. They'd clearly feared Robb might refuse or insist the Vale handle its own issues. But that was not the way of the New Realm. Robb believed strongly that each region was interconnected. A civil conflict in the Vale would soon spill over into neighboring lands. They shared a meal together, discussing details. Sansa jotted notes about who should attend. Brienne entered partway through, quietly offering to ride as Robb's personal guard. Robb accepted gratefully. Catelyn insisted on coming as well. Her personal ties to Lysa might soothe tensions. Plans solidified. A departure within a fortnight, by which time a ravaged mountain pass might be cleared of debris from a recent rock slide. Afterwards, the travelers retired to their guest quarters, grateful for Winterfell's hospitality. Robb and Sansa lingered at the table, finalizing logistics. The day's light faded outside the hall's windows, and torches were lit to chase away the early autumn dark. Finally, Sansa stretched, setting aside her parchment. It's late. We can continue in the morning. Robb nodded. Good. You should rest. A trip to the Vale. It may be physically less arduous than a battle, but we're walking into a political storm. Sansa stood and placed a hand on his shoulder briefly. We'll weather it together, Robb. That's how we've come this far, is it not? He squeezed her hand. Aye. Good night, Sansa. She drifted off to her chambers, and Robb took a few moments to tidy up. He left the hall with Grey Wind padding beside him, the castle quiet but not silent. He could still hear distant laughter from the kitchens, a baby's cry somewhere in the guest wing, the scrape of a watchman's boots on the ramparts above. It was a lived-in hush, reassuring. He made his way to his private chambers. They were simpler than the old lord's chambers, with minimal decoration. Just a sturdy bed, a table for writing, a thick rug to keep the chill off the floor, and a chest for his clothes. Grey Wind curled up near the door. Robb shrugged out of his cloak, draping it over a chair, then sat on the bed to unlace his boots. He felt the day's fatigue washing over him. Yet, as he sank onto the mattress, his mind churned with thoughts of the Vale. Eventually, lulled by Grey Wind's breathing and the faint flicker of a dying candle, he drifted into sleep. Morning arrived crisp and bright. The weeks that followed were a flurry of activity as couriers were sent out to confirm arrangements. Robb delegated some of his northern governance duties to trusted counselors. Lady Meg Mormont had proven adept at leading the local militias, while a man named Harlan Rudd, a on-a-time steward from the Riverlands, oversaw daily resource distribution in Winterfell's name. Everyone understood the stakes. If the Vale erupted in conflict, it might spread or inspire other reactionaries to rise up. The new order was only as strong as the realm's willingness to cooperate. When the departure day came, Robb found himself standing in the courtyard, bundled in furs against the chill. The sky was slate gray, thick with clouds promising early snows. Before him waited a modest group of about 30 riders. Brienne of Tarth in her blue cloak. The Great John insisted on coming too, though he had grumbled at the small size of the escort. A handful of loyal northern guards, and a few delegates. Among them, Maester Nathan of Winterfell, whose wise counsel might be invaluable, and a pair of Smallfolk representatives who had volunteered to see the Vale's situation firsthand. Sansa and Catelyn rode in a covered wagon, better for cold mountain passes, though both insisted they'd ride horseback as soon as the roads were safer. Grey Wind prowled at Robb's side, an imposing presence that often dissuaded trouble. Stable hands finished adjusting girths and harnesses. Robb mounted his horse, scanning the group with a measured nod. We ride south, then east. We'll cross the White Knife at the Twins. He paused, recalling the ominous name of that crossing. Once upon a time, Walder Frey had infamously betrayed them, but House Frey's seat had been radically changed since the war. The new Freedmen's Council had displaced the Frey's tyranny, leaving them a family in disgrace. We'll continue from there along the edges of the Riverlands, then up through the mountains to the Vale. Everyone ready? The travelers muttered agreement. The gates opened, letting in a gust of cold wind. With a final wave to those who stayed behind, Robb urged his horse forward. The column moved out, hooves clattering on the drawbridge. Once beyond the walls, they followed the old road winding south. Days of travel stretched into nights at small inns or friendly hamlets. Everywhere they went, the presence of the king in the north and his modest party drew onlookers, but not with the same hush of awe that had once greeted kings. Rather, people seemed eager to speak, to voice concerns, to share gratitude that the war was over. Some asked for advice or aid, others offered what meager comforts they could. Robb did his best to listen, to promise what help was possible. Sansa's ability to recall people's names and personal stories endeared her to them. Catelyn likewise exuded a maternal warmth. Brienne proved a quiet sentinel, seldom speaking except to reassure anxious villagers that no harm would come to them. Often, the Greatjon entertained gatherings at night with tall tales of the battles they'd survived, or stories of the northern moors where he hunted great elk. Men and women alike would gather around, enthralled, the tension of years melting into laughter. Crossing into the Riverlands felt like stepping into an old memory. Rivers wound through rolling hills, farmland dotted with thatched cottages. Once, this place had been ravaged by Lannister troops and gutted by a seemingly endless tide of war. Now it showed signs of recovery, though pockets of ruin lingered. The Freedmen's Council in the Riverlands had done a decent job redistributing farmland from old lords who'd abandoned their holdings, but some disputes continued. At nearly every waypoint, local representatives sought an audience with Robb. He obliged them, mindful of the overarching mission to the Vale, but determined not to ignore Riverland problems. One evening, they stayed at an inn near a stout wooden bridge crossing the Red Fork. The inn was cheerful enough, with a crackling hearth and a friendly innkeeper who recognized Robb and offered them a private room for a meal. As they settled at a long table, Catelyn gazed around with nostalgic eyes. You know, Edmure once courted a miller's daughter who lived not far from here. She was a sweet girl with hair like spun copper. I wonder if she's around still. Sansa smiled. Perhaps she's on the local council now. That would be a tale. Nor. Brienne, seated awkwardly on a small stool that barely supported her tall frame, asked, "Has there been word from Lord Edmure recently?" Catelyn nodded. "Yes, occasional letters. He's faring well in Riverrun, working closely with the Freedmen's Council there. He's found a balance, though I suspect he misses simpler days. I'll see him again soon enough, I hope." Robb, sipping ale, felt a pang at that. Riverrun had once been a seat of Tully power, and now it was shared among many. The Tully name lived on, of course, but it was no longer all important. Perhaps that was a good thing, an end to the illusions of grandeur that so often led to ruin. He set his mug down as a timid knock sounded at the door. One of their guards peered in. "Beg pardon, Your Grace, but there's a group outside who'd like to greet you. Some local farmers. Should I tell them to wait until morning?" Robb glanced around. Sansa shrugged, half smiling. "It might do them good to be heard." "Let them in," Robb said. "We can greet them here." Moments later, about half a dozen farmers shuffled inside, hats in hand. They were mostly older men, sun-baked and stooped, with a single woman among them whose hands were rough with calluses. They bowed slightly, though not in the deep, subservient way of old. Their eyes held a quiet respect. "Your Grace," said the eldest man, "we know you're headed east. We wanted to thank you for what you did for these lands. We remember the war. We lost our homes and half our kin. But now we have new farmland, free and clear. No lord demanding half our harvest. We owe you a debt." Robb stood. "No debt, my friends. The harvest is yours because it always should have been. I only regret we couldn't do more sooner." "Nani?" The woman, her hair tied in a kerchief, looked near tears. "We heard rumors that others want to fight you, or that the old lords scheme to take back what they lost. If that happens, if another war starts, we'll stand by you, all of us. We have pitchforks and spades if it comes to that." A lump rose in Robb's throat. He saw the sincerity in their lined faces. These were not professional warriors but ordinary folk willing to defend the new realm they believed in. He stepped forward and clasped the woman's hand between his own. "I hope it never comes to that, but if it does, I'm honored to stand with you. And I promise, I'll do all I can to keep war from your doorstep again." The farmers looked at each other, expressions relieved, before shuffling out quietly. Robb watched them go, a swirl of emotions in his chest, gratitude, responsibility, a twinge of fear for what might lie ahead. How many innocents would rally to him if the old guard rose in arms? The realm was changing, but the defenders of the old ways would not vanish without a fight. They resumed their meal, subdued but thoughtful. Afterward, Brienne took first watch outside the inn. The Greatjon accompanied her. Robb retired to his chamber. A single candle flickered on a rough-hewn table. Grey wind lay near the door, as always. Though Robb felt bone-tired, sleep eluded him for a time. He stared at the low ceiling beams, listening to the quiet murmurs in the corridor. Sansa was in the adjacent room with Catelyn, probably reading letters or tidying the day's notes. The wind whistled outside, carrying the distant hush of the river. Eventually, lulled by the sense of a temporary haven, he drifted into a dreamless slumber. At dawn, they departed the inn, forging onward into the riverlands. As they rode, the land rose in gentle slopes, gradually turning rocky as they neared the foothills of the Mountains of the Moon. Summer was well behind them, and the weather grew colder each day. Frost rimed the grasses at sunrise. The Greatjon, stoically enduring the chill, occasionally roared out a laugh about wanting a proper northern winter. Brienne scouted ahead, Sansa and Catelyn sharing the wagon for warmth. Robb, astride a roan mare, kept Grey Wind at a loping pace. They encountered only a few scattered hamlets, each huddled closer to the roads for fear of bandits. None dared linger alone in the open fields. A week into the journey, they approached the high mountain pass that led to the Vale. Snow dusted the peaks. Once, the Bloody Gate stood as a fierce barrier, controlled by Vale Lords determined to protect their region from outside threats. Now, it was nominally in the hands of the Freedmen's Council, though Lady Lysa still exerted some influence. As the column wound its way up a narrow trail, guards wearing the Falcon and Moon sigil emerged from a small tower, calling for them to halt. Robb raised a hand, signaling peace. The guards studied the travelers warily, then seemed to recognize Robb. They called out, "Open the pass! The king in the north is here on official business." A heavy wooden gate swayed open, revealing the precarious switchback road beyond. The Vale's rolling meadows were not yet visible, only the towering snow-capped peaks on either side, like silent watchers. Robb led his party through. The guards parted with uncertain respect, glancing at Grey Wind. Some murmured about the direwolf's size. Robb politely thanked them and continued on. After half a day more of travel, the path broadened, and the Vale spread out below, a vast fertile basin ringed by mountains, dotted with villages and patches of forest in brilliant autumn color. From this vantage it looked peaceful, but the tension simmering below might rival any storm. They pressed on to a larger settlement known as Stonegrove, where the Freedmen's Council had arranged lodging for them. Stonegrove was no city, just a sizable village with a central meeting hall, a few inns, and farmland stretching out from its borders. Despite the crisp air, the fields looked healthy. Riders in Vale colors trotted around the settlement, keeping watch. As Robb's party arrived, Smallfolk peered out from doorways. Some recognized him, rushing forward with hesitant cheers or calls of greeting. Others hung back with suspicion, uncertain whether to trust this new order. Outside the largest inn, a cluster of local council members awaited, clearly briefed on the visit. An older man in a patched cloak, a young woman with short dark hair, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, but wore an air of gravity. These and more came forward to welcome Robb and his delegation. Sansa and Catelyn dismounted from the wagon, stretching stiff limbs, while Brienne scanned the surroundings for threats. The older man introduced himself. "Your Grace, I am Herod, a counselor here in Stonegrove. Lady Lysa's men arrived yesterday, preparing for your coming. We'll guide you to the meeting hall. They're expecting you tomorrow, or the day after, depending on your rest." "No one's serious." Robb shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Herod. We appreciate the welcome. We'll rest our horses and gather our wits, then we'll meet with Lady Lysa and the other Vale Lords. Are they in the Eyrie or here in Stonegrove?" Herod exchanged a look with the short-haired woman. "Lady Lysa remains in the Eyrie. She sent a representative, Sir Albar Belmore, to speak for her until she deigns to descend. However, we hear she might come down if you personally request it, Your Grace." Robb stifled a sigh. We'll see. Lead on, please. End. They followed the council members through winding lanes to a cluster of low buildings near the settlement center. One was a sturdy structure used for community gatherings, a kind of half-fort, half-hall. Robb's company stabled their horses, set up their personal quarters in a spacious loft, and soon warmed themselves at a roaring hearth. Outside, the sky darkened and clouds scudded across the mountaintops. The next morning, Robb rose early, determined to begin the peace talks. The Freedmen's Council had arranged for all concerned parties to gather in that very hall. He dressed in warm leathers trimmed with fur. Sansa wore a simpler gown suitable for travel, and Catelyn chose a modest but elegant cloak of tully blue. Brienne, of course, wore her armor, sword belted at her side. Grey Wind loped at Robb's heel as they crossed the courtyard into the hall. Inside, the space was large enough to accommodate perhaps 100 people. Several rows of benches were arranged facing a long table. At that table sat a cluster of Vale lords: Sir Albar Belmore, a tall man with a hawk-like nose and sharp eyes; Lady Waynwood, who was somewhat sympathetic to the freedmen's movement; Lord Nestor Royce, a distant cousin to the Royce who'd brought the message; and a few lesser knights. On the other side sat a group of Freedmen's Council representatives. Enya Stone was among them, along with about 20 smaller folk delegates from across the Vale, each with varied attire. Some wore patched cloaks, others the simple rough spun of farmers. It was a stark contrast, one side clothed in mild finery, the other side in homespun sincerity. As Robb's party entered, a murmur passed through the hall. Sir Albar stood stiffly, offering a short bow. The freedmen's representatives nodded respectfully. Robb approached the head of the table but did not seat himself in a throne-like chair. Instead, he stood behind it, encouraging everyone else to remain standing for the moment. "Good morning," he said. "I thank you all for gathering. We come on behalf of the New Realm, seeking to ease the tensions that plague the Vale. We do not come to usurp your authority, but to help ensure justice and peace for all. May we speak plainly?" "Nah." Sir Albar's expression remained guarded, but Lady Waynwood inclined her head. "We welcome your perspective, Your Grace." Lord Nestor Royce tapped his fingers on the table. "We all want stability, but some question the radical changes you've instituted elsewhere. Nobles worry about losing their rights in Smallfolk." He paused, glancing uncomfortably at the Freedmen's Council. "They want more than we might be able to give, if we're to maintain order." One of the freedmen's delegates, a woman with an upright posture named Imogen, spoke up. "We want what King Robb promised, that no person is born to serve another against their will, that each region's wealth belongs to all who labor for it, not only a select few with noble blood. Is that so frightening, my lord?" Sir Albar's nostrils flared. "The Vale's traditions run deep. We are sworn to house Arryn, an ancient line. We cannot simply throw that away." Catelyn stepped forward. "No one says you must throw away all tradition. The Starks still guide the North, but they do so by consensus with councils of free men and women. We have not declared ourselves above them, but rather pledged to protect them. Lady Lysa can remain Lady of the Eyrie if she accepts the Freedmen's Council's rightful place in governance. Is that so terrible a compromise?" Sir Albar's gaze darted to Nestor Royce, who gave a tight nod. "We might consider such an arrangement," said Royce grudgingly. "But Lady Lysa must have the final say in matters of security and justice. The Vale is her seat." "Not so." Anya Stone's mouth pressed into a firm line. "Many of us fear Lady Lysa's final say. She's used it before to quell dissent through intimidation. We need clear checks on her power, trial by a neutral council, not just the Moon Door." The mention of the Moon Door, that infamous portal in the Erie's floor through which Lady Lysa could cast her enemies to a skybound grave, sent a ripple of unease through the hall. Even the aristocrats looked uncomfortable. Brienne, arms folded behind Robb, tensed slightly at the tension in the air. Robb raised a hand gently. "We can find a middle path. Let Lady Lysa keep her seat as a figurehead, or as a leading voice, but ensure the Freedmen's Council has binding authority on issues of farmland distribution, local governance, fair taxation. If security concerns arise, the council will work in tandem with Lady Lysa's chosen officials. No single party can overrule the other without a formal hearing. This sort of dual structure is what we implemented in the North, with House Stark and the Freedmen's." Sir Albar stared at him, uncertain. Some of the Freedmen's delegates exchanged whispered looks. They'd known something like this might be proposed, and though not all were satisfied, it felt like a major step toward equality in a land long dominated by House Aaron. One by one, people voiced concerns or grudging acceptance. The conversation waxed and waned, at times heated. Robb, Sansa, and Catelyn each stepped in to calm or clarify. Grey Wind remained a silent sentinel, ironically making a far more civilized impression than many barons might have. In the end, after hours of debate, they agreed to a framework. The freedmen's delegates insisted that Lady Lysa come down from the Eyrie within the week to sign any formal agreement. She had to show good faith by appearing in person. A raven was dispatched to the Eyrie that afternoon, urging her to attend. Sir Albar's lips thinned at the mention, but he agreed to wait. The hall emptied as dusk approached, leaving Robb's party to catch their breath. They'd made progress, but the real test would be Lady Lysa's response. That evening, a cold wind blew down from the peaks, rattling the shutters of the building where Robb's group stayed. Huddled by a fire, Robb and Sansa reviewed a rough draft of the Vale's new compromise. Catelyn paced the room, fretful, no doubt dreading how Lysa might react. The Great John, seated with a half-empty tankard of ale, gave a hearty snort. "This is all well and good, but, mark my words, there'll be holdouts. Some old codger will prefer the old ways, or some Smallfolk radical will want to cast every lord off a cliff. You might end up policing 1,000 petty quarrels." Robb sighed. "That's better than open war." Perhaps," the Great John conceded. "Still, keep your sword sharp, lad. You'll need it." "No." Later that night, after the others had turned in, Robb ventured outside for a short walk to clear his head. Grey Wind bounded along, sniffing the crisp mountain air. The settlement's muddy lanes were lit only by a few torches set in brackets. Carts were parked near wooden pens holding goats, and a few cows. Now and then a guard or villager strode by, offering a nod to Robb. He wandered to a low stone wall that overlooked a slope descending into a wooded valley. Moonlight glinted on the distant rooftops of smaller hamlets. High above, the mountains loomed, their summits crowned with snow that reflected silver in the moonlight. "Father would be proud," Robb murmured to himself, letting the quiet envelop him. The wind tugged at his cloak, carrying the scents of pine and cold stone. This was the Vale, distinct from the north, yet it felt eerily similar in its raw, untamed beauty. The future perched on a knife's edge, and only cooperation would keep it from toppling. Grey Wind's ears perked suddenly. The direwolf's nose twitched. A moment later, Robb heard it too, a distant cry or shout, quickly muffled. He straightened, scanning the darkness. Another shout reached them, echoing up from the lower edge of the village. Robb rested a hand on his sword hilt. "Come," he said softly to Grey Wind, then hurried toward the sound. He followed winding lanes down a gentle slope, the houses growing sparser. Finally, he spotted torchlight flickering by a storage barn. A scuffle was in progress, barely visible in the gloom. Several figures grappled with each other. A shrill voice cried, "Stop, thief!" Another voice cursed. Grey Wind let out a low growl. Robb rushed forward, calling out, "Halt in the name of the realm!" One man froze at the sound of authority, turning wide eyes on Robb. Another took advantage of the distraction to bolt into the darkness. Grey Wind sprang after him in a flash of muscle and fur, tackling the fleeing figure to the ground with a yelp. Robb dashed toward the commotion, sword half drawn. As he neared, the pinned man whimpered, "Gods, get this beast off me!" "Grey Wind," Robb commanded. The direwolf bared his teeth but let go of the man's arm, stepping back warily. Robb pinned the man with a fierce glare. The figure was young, maybe 20, with a thin face and rough clothing. "What are you doing here?" The other person approached, a middle-aged woman, presumably the barn's keeper. Her breath came in gasps. "They were trying to steal our grain stores. We're short enough as it is." Robb looked down at the cowering thief. "Is that true?" The man grimaced, clutching a bleeding scratch on his arm. My family's starving. The Freedmen's Council claims all belongs to everyone, so I thought." "Stealing from your neighbors? That's not how it works," Robb said evenly. "If you need food, you petition the council. They have distributions set up for those in dire straits." The man muttered bitterly, "They said we had to wait. I couldn't, my kids are hungry. I can't watch them starve while the barns are full." A pang tugged at Robb's heart. He offered his hand to help the man up. We'll settle this properly. No more thievery. We have ways to ensure families don't starve. The barnkeeper glared, but Robb raised a hand to calm her. I'll pay for whatever was damaged. Let's speak with the local council at first light. We'll find a solution. Why? She eyed the man warily but nodded. Then she studied Robb's face, recognition dawning. You're… Yes, I'm Robb Stark. He forced a gentle tone. And I promise, we'll see you fairly compensated, and this man's family fed. The tension eased a fraction. A pair of local watchmen ran up, panting, having heard the commotion. Robb quickly explained, instructing them to escort the thief, who gave his name as Karen, to a safe holding place until morning without rough treatment. The barnkeeper thanked Robb and returned to her property, checking the grain sacks with a worried scowl. As the watchman led Karen away, Robb and Grey Wind made their way back through the quiet lanes. He felt the heavy reminder that the new realm was more complicated than any crown. Hunger and fear could still drive men to desperation. He reported the incident to the Freedmen's Council delegates that night. By morning, they'd arranged a quick hearing where both parties could present their case. Karen turned out to have 3 children, his wife dead from illness the prior winter, leaving him struggling to manage the small patch of land had been granted. The Freedmen's Council had tried to help, but resources ran short in these remote villages, especially in the transition from feudal holdings to communal distribution. The barnkeeper, who introduced herself as Mira, understood this but insisted that random theft threatened everyone. If each starving family raided the stores, the entire community might collapse. Robb sat quietly, letting the local council handle most of the conversation. They weighed both sides, recognized Karen's desperate situation, and agreed that while theft must be discouraged, the real root was insufficient distribution. In the end, they imposed only mild restitution. Karen would labor for a period repairing roads and barns, including Mira's, so that the community might benefit. Meanwhile, they pledged to accelerate shipments of surplus from more prosperous villages to Stonegrove. The entire process took half the morning with no swords drawn, no threats of prisons or severed hands. When it was over, Karen apologized haltingly to Mira, who accepted it with a hesitant nod. The Freedmen's Council took note of the shortfalls. Robb felt a spark of hope. The solution wasn't perfect, but it was a step. Perhaps conflicts like these could be resolved without bloodshed if local councils had the power and the resources to act quickly. That day, no raven arrived from Lady Lysa. Nor the next. By the 3rd day, tension grew. The freedmen's delegates muttered that she might ignore them entirely. Sir Albar tried to placate them, claiming the climb down from the Eyrie was dangerous this time of year, but few believed that was the real reason. Robb decided to send a second messenger, more direct in tone, urging Lysa to appear or risk losing her seat altogether. Meanwhile, they continued to refine the proposed compromise, with the Vale Lords grudgingly adjusting old taxes, the freedmen's delegates modifying certain demands. Sansa proved adept at bridging differences, weaving her courtesy around fraying tempers. But they could do only so much without the presence of the region's official lady. Finally, on the 4th day, a small party was spotted descending the perilous path from the Eyrie. Word reached Stonegrove by midday that Lady Lysa was among them, traveling in a litter carried by mules, accompanied by a retinue of Eyrie guards. Everyone rushed to prepare the meeting hall. Robb stood at the entrance, flanked by Catelyn and Sansa, with Brienne and the Great Jean behind them, all waiting in the chill mountain wind as the entourage approached. Lysa Arryn arrived swathed in thick furs, her face pale and drawn. She was still beautiful in a delicate way, but her eyes had a certain wildness, a fluttering worry about them. She barely glanced at the freedmen's delegates or the local onlookers. Instead, her gaze locked onto Catelyn. "Cat," Lysa breathed, voice trembling. "You're here. She cut off, stepping from her litter with help from a guard. Her posture was stiff, head high. "I've come to see what all this fuss is about. They say you want to carve up the Vale like a roast and hand it to peasants. I can't imagine you of all people supporting that." Catelyn forced a thin smile. "Sister, we only want to ensure peace and fairness. Please let's speak inside where it's warm." The freedmen's delegates parted, letting Lysa and her guard pass. Sir Albar hurried up to greet her, bowing low and trying to reassure her that no one intended to dethrone her. Lysa brushed him off with a flick of her hand, glancing warily at Robb. "Your Grace," she said almost bitterly, "must you meddle in the Vale's affairs so? We have a proud tradition. The Vale has stood inviolate for centuries." "Nearer." Robb maintained a respectful tone. "We all stand under one realm now, Lady Lysa. I only seek to help the Vale find a peaceful path forward, as we did in the North and Riverlands." She huffed, turning away, but she followed them into the meeting hall, muttering under her breath. Inside, the crowd settled. The freedmen's delegates watched with steeled expressions, the Vale lords with anxious ones. Lysa removed her fur cloak, revealing a gown of deep blue. She swept to the head of the table and sat, ignoring social niceties. "Very well," she said, glancing around. "Tell me of this plan you've concocted. I'll see if there's any sense in it." Anya Stone stepped forward, voice calm but firm, explaining how the Freedmen's Council envisioned a shared governance system. Sir Albar and Lady Waynwood added their perspective. Robb and Caitlin occasionally clarified. Through it all, Lysa's expression ran the gamut from disbelief to outrage to grudging interest. She insisted that the Eyrie's security needs were paramount, complaining that peasants knew nothing of defending mountain passes or maintaining watchtowers. Eventually, after many rounds of heated discussion, Lysa demanded a recess. She rose abruptly, beckoning Caitlin to her side. "Come, we'll speak privately," she said, casting a side glance at Robb. "Without so many prying ears." Caitlin nodded warily. They slipped away to a smaller chamber adjacent to the main hall with the Freedmen's Council watching anxiously. Robb wanted to protest but decided it might help for the sisters to speak alone. Time dragged. The Freedmen's delegates whispered among themselves. The Vale lords looked uneasy. Sansa paced by the hearth, glancing at the door every few moments. Robb stared at the swirling motes of dust in a ray of sunlight. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door opened, and Caitlin stepped out, followed by Lysa. Caitlin's face was drawn but resolute. Lysa's expression was unreadable. She moved to the table and said in a loud, if somewhat tremulous voice, "I've decided to accept a compromise." A ripple of surprise spread through the hall. Even Sir Albar blinked. Lysa continued, "The Freedmen's Council will have authority over local governance, taxes, farmland distribution, resource management. I, as Lady of the Eyrie, will maintain final security matters, garrison movements, and alliances with other regions. However, if there is a disagreement, a joint tribunal of both sides shall convene." She exhaled, as if the words had cost her dearly. Imogen of the Freedmen's Council exchanged a quick glance with her colleagues and spoke hesitantly. "That is close to what we asked for. We'll need specific language, but it sounds workable." Robb stepped forward. "I'm glad to hear it. This ensures Lady Lysa's position is respected while granting real power to the Freedmen's Council. If you both can respect that arrangement, I believe the Vale can remain at peace." Lysa's lips twitched, almost a smile. "For my dear sister's sake, I'll sign. But do not mistake me, I will not let the Vale be overrun by chaos. If this fails, if the Freedmen's Council oversteps, we'll revert to the old ways. Understood?" Robb inclined his head, though his tone remained steady. "Understood, and if the Freedmen's Council needs protection from tyrannical overreach, you can expect the North to intervene. That's the balance." A flicker of resentment crossed Lysa's face, but she held her tongue. The Freedmen's delegates, for their part, withheld celebrations, waiting to see if the words would become real. Nevertheless, a sense of relief swept the hall. They drew up a formal document right then and there, the scribes working with trembling quills. Lysa signed first, her signature wavering. Then the Freedmen's Council representatives added their marks. Witnesses from the Vale Lords, from House Stark, from local watchers. It was done. At last, the immediate crisis abated. Lysa agreed to remain in Stonegrove for a day or two to finalize details with the Freedmen's Council. Robb's presence was no longer strictly necessary, but he stayed to ensure there were no last-minute objections. He was cordial with Lysa, though she eyed him with a mix of caution and scorn. When the Freedmen's Council invited him to a celebratory meal that evening, Lysa declined to attend, retiring to her chambers with only a mention of her son Robin. The boy was rumored to be ill in the Eyrie, one reason she'd delayed. Still, the Freedmen's Council seemed satisfied that progress was made. That night, under a sky dusted with stars, the delegates gathered around a long row of tables set up in the open air, near a crackling bonfire. Musicians played a gentle tune, half lively, half haunting, the notes drifting into the crisp mountain wind. The smell of roast goat and hot spiced wine mingled in the chill. Village folk, Freedmen's Council members, Vale Knights, who had slowly come around to the compromise, they all broke bread together. Robb sat near the center, Sansa on one side, Brienne on the other. The Greyjohn mingled with some of the Vale's lesser nobles, ironically bonding over old war stories. Grey Wind, sniffing around the periphery, drew cautious admiration from children. Catelyn moved from table to table, speaking quietly with folks who recognized her as a Tully, or as Lady Stark. Sometimes she tried to reassure them about Lysa's state of mind. She'd confided in Robb that Lysa's paranoia ran deep, a legacy of childhood traumas and the wars they had both endured. For now, though, the compromise held. It was all they could ask. Under the dancing firelight, one of the Freedmen's delegates raised a mug in toast. To new beginnings. A chorus echoed the sentiment. Robb lifted his own mug, heart warmed by a sense of accomplishment. This was how it should be. Not lords crushing peasants or peasants toppling lords in bloodshed, but both sides forging a path toward mutual respect. The music shifted to a livelier tune, spurring a few people to dance. Laughter rang out. For a moment, Robb let himself just be present in that joy. The realm was not perfect, far from it. But night by night, step by step, it was healing. When dawn came, Lady Lysa was off to the Eyrie again, having scrawled final notes on the agreement. She left briskly, accompanied by her retinue. A sense of relief rippled through Stone Grove. The Freedmen's Council got to work implementing the new structure. Robb, deciding it was time to return north, arranged for a few of his delegates to remain in the Vale temporarily, acting as neutral observers. Sir Theomund Royce volunteered to help them navigate local customs. Everyone parted on guarded but hopeful terms. Robb's party departed Stone Grove with a lighter heart than when they'd arrived. They took a slightly different route back, eager to visit smaller villages in the Vale to confirm that the new compromise would be enforced. Along the way, they found more evidence of small-scale disputes, banditry in the high passes, arguments over farmland boundaries. But the Freedmen's Council in each region seemed motivated to solve these issues without calling for war or feudal oppression. Sansa chronicled each instance diligently, planning to relay the information to central authorities so that resources could be directed appropriately. By the time they retraced their path past the Bloody Gate, autumn had deepened. Winds grew sharper, scattering leaves in swirling gusts. The Greyjohn teased Sansa about southern softness when she complained of the cold, but she pointed out with a laugh that she was still a Stark of Winterfell. Brienne gazed at the encroaching weather with stoic acceptance, remarking only that Tarth, her homeland, rarely saw such a bite in the air. Day by day they descended out of the mountains and re-entered the riverlands. The trip home was quieter than the outward journey, though not without minor incidents. They once crossed paths with a caravan of traveling singers who recognized Robb and offered to perform ballads of the Wolf King and the Freed People. Robb politely asked them to keep the lyrics fair and not spin him into some mythic figure. The lead singer smiled, promising to try. When at last they reached the wide, slow-moving waters of the Trident, it felt almost like stepping into a memory. Robb paused on a riverbank, remembering battles fought and lost. The old bitterness that once fueled him had transformed into a gentler, more reflective sorrow. War had cost him his father, cost them all too much. Yet, in that crucible they had forged a new realm. Grey Wind sniffed at the water's edge, lapping tentatively. Robb led him, then urged the party onward. They spent a night in a large village near Riverrun. Edmure had sent a messenger with an invitation to visit, but Robb declined to detour. Winterfell needed him home before the snows made travel impossible. He did exchange letters with Edmure, hearing news that the Riverlands Freedmen's Council continued to flourish, though some holdouts remained. The old houses fray and some offshoots tried to stir trouble, but the people no longer feared them as they once had. A compromise might soon be reached with scattered pockets of resistance. The next leg of the journey took them across the rocky northern hills. On the horizon, the weather changed daily. One morning bright sun, the next day thick clouds spitting cold rain. They reached an inn near an abandoned village that had once been burned in the war. Now it showed signs of slow rebuilding. The innkeeper greeted them warmly, remembering them from months prior. He reported that more travelers ventured freely these days, and brigand attacks had dwindled, proof that their efforts were working. Robb thanked him, paying generously for lodging. At last, they passed through the region near the Twins, that once infamous crossing. No great fortress or wardens controlled it now. The Freedmen's Council of the Green Fork oversaw a patchwork of local watchposts. Still, the memory of the Red Wedding lingered in Robb's bones. He felt the ghost of it in every gust of wind that swept the wide, empty fields. In that place he had lost so many loved ones. He had nearly lost himself. The Great John too looked grim. But the road was safer now. They crossed unchallenged, a small group of watchers offering polite nods, more concerned about genuine threats than travelers. Finally, the land rose into the neck, the boggy region that separated the north from the rest of Westeros. Trolls might be stuff of legend, but the biting insects and treacherous ground were real enough. Robb led them carefully along the known paths, recalling how once these swamps had aided them in war. Now they parted for returning travelers, a barrier less to keep out invaders than to preserve the independence and unity they had built. Another few days of cautious trudging, and the air changed again. The crisp, pine-scented breezes of the north, the faint swirl of snow in the corners of the sky. Their arrival at Winterfell was heralded by horns atop the walls. The gates swung open, letting them in. Even after weeks away, the castle bustled with new life, expansions in mid-progress. Tents around the outer wards had consolidated, replaced by newly built cottages for families who'd chosen to stay. The old walls, battered from the Greyjoy assault, were more fully repaired now, thanks to volunteer labor from across the north and the Freedmen's Council's funding. The courtyard erupted in cheers as Robb's party entered, people rushing forward to greet them with genuine warmth. Children called out Sansa's name, a few men doffed caps at Lady Catelyn, and Brienne gave polite nods to those who thanked her for protecting the realm's leaders. Robb dismounted, letting out a long breath of relief. Maester Nathan hurried forward, anxious for news. "Your Grace, I trust all went well in the Vale." Robb offered a weary grin. "We found a compromise. The Vale stands with us. We'll see how it holds." A swirl of bustle followed, folks gathering to learn more about what had transpired. Robb took Sansa's hand, gently tugging her along, and found his mother's arm hooking through his. They marched across the yard toward the great keep. Grey Wind trotted proudly at their side, tail held high. It felt like home, truly home, a place not just for House Stark, but for everyone forging a better future. Over the next few days, they debriefed the Northern Councils, explained the Vale's arrangement, and integrated new insights into the realm-wide council network. Ravens flew out bearing messages of the success. Some letters returned quickly with updates from other regions, encouraging news from the Westerlands, where local councils had begun meeting in old Lannister halls. Word from King's Landing was that the Freedmen's Council there struggled with a near-empty treasury, but had staved off riots by redistributing what little remained. The city's walls still stood, though less menacingly so. Jaime Lannister ironically had stayed on as a sort of city guard commander, though his power was limited by the council. Cersei had vanished from public view. A new society was being born from the ashes, but that birth was not without pain. Robb resumed his daily rounds in Winterfell, checking on farmland expansions, hearing disputes, making sure resources flowed. The days shortened, winter creeping in by degrees, yet the realm seemed more prepared for it than in many years. The Freedmen's Councils had shared harvests widely, no longer forcing each region to hoard supplies for fear of lords' demands. When the first real snowfall arrived, big, lazy flakes drifting down one twilight, people took it with good cheer. Children chased each other in the courtyard, tongues outstretched to catch flakes. Sansa smiled, reminded of childhood innocence. Catelyn looked skyward, perhaps recalling Ned, who would have relished this moment of calm. Robb felt a quiet sense of triumph. This was the North he loved, bracing weather, a sturdy hearth, a community bound by more than fear. Yet, even as the realm settled into a precarious peace, new tidings from afar began to stir. Rumors that Daenerys Targaryen had indeed conquered more cities in Essos, forging alliances with the freed peoples there, started to drift across the narrow sea. Stories told of 3 dragons grown large enough to lay waste to entire armies. Some whispered that Daenerys would see Westeros as her birthright, that she would come with fire and blood to claim what was lost. Others suggested she might align with a realm that championed freedom, if only Westeros recognized her as a rightful queen. The question hung in the air: would they clash, or come to an accord? But that was a trial for another time. Winter lay at the gates of the north, and the people's immediate concern was to endure the cold months without famine or strife. Snow piled higher. Roads became impassable. Winterfell's great hall filled nightly with families gathered around roaring fires, sharing stew and mead, singing old songs. Scribes copied fresh laws onto parchment, ensuring new fair codes were distributed across the realm when spring allowed. Robb took solace in these cozy scenes, often roaming the hall with Grey Wind, greeting folk who invited him to sit, share a meal, or simply talk. Sometimes he'd listen for hours to a farmer's tale of the autumn harvest, or to a blacksmith's plan to forge new tools come spring. It was the kind of simple, honest bond that once had seemed impossible under the hierarchy of the old order. Even so, Robb knew that peace required vigilance. He spoke privately with Lady Catelyn and Sansa about how to handle the next steps. Should they reach out formally to Daenerys Targaryen? Should they focus on rooting out the last pockets of banditry within Westeros? Should they reinforce the southern roads to protect the freedmen's councils in the Crownlands? The realm's tapestry was vast and complicated. No single man or woman could oversee it all. Hence, the councils. Yet they still looked to Robb for guidance, a symbol of unity, the Wolf King who had freed the Smallfolk. It was a mantle he wore humbly, determined never to let it grow into tyranny. On a frosty morning, Robb stood atop Winterfell's walls, gazing over a courtyard half buried in snow. The dawn sky glowed pale pink. Workers trod carefully, clearing paths so that folk could move about. Smoke curled from the chimneys of the keep, carrying a scent of cooking oats. Despite the cold, life thrived here. He leaned on a crenellation, exhaling plumes of breath. Grey Wind sat beside him, tail wrapped around his paws. "Winter is here," Robb whispered, recalling the old house's dark words. It was a reminder that no victory is ever final, that life is a cycle of trials and renewals. They had ended one war by freeing the Smallfolk, but the realm's story continued. He found a certain comfort in that unending journey. As long as the people believed in their own power and refused to be trampled, as long as they reached across divides to share bread instead of brandishing swords, the realm would continue to grow stronger. He looked to the east, imagining the far-off seas and the rumor of dragons. He looked to the south, picturing the freedmen's councils forging new paths. He looked to the west, where the Westerlands slowly learned to govern without the Lannister name overshadowing them. And he looked to the far north, beyond the wall, a place of myths and secrets. A place that might one day demand their attention again, though for now it was silent. Standing there, Robb Stark felt no crown upon his head, only the steady weight of responsibility and hope. He was content with that. In the hush of the winter morning, he closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the father who had once stood on these same walls. Then he turned and descended the steps into the life of Winterfell, a life shared by all who sought freedom and justice in the realm they were rebuilding day by day, choice by choice, hand in hand. And so the snows continued to fall, blanketing a land that had once been torn asunder by war and vendettas, now slowly mending under the leadership of a king who chose to kneel to the will of the people, a queen across the sea, whose destiny remained unwritten, and countless free souls who discovered that the power to shape their future had always resided in their own two hands.